Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
Look at Jeremiah chapter 2, please. My basic intent in going through the Old Testament verse by verse is twofold. Number one, you almost have to find what the context is and what the Hebrew words mean and what the relationship between sentences are to get the message that Jeremiah was trying to give to his own day. And secondly, the longer you stay with me through Old Testament passages, the more the Old Testament is going to start fitting into place for you. Words, Old Testament words, are going to have greater depth of meaning. Relationships between the Old Testament and the New will begin to come to life. And so I hope those two things will be a meaningful part of your overall Bible knowledge. Okay? Now, in Jeremiah chapter 2, we have a very good example of the preaching of the 8th century prophets. And of course, by that, I'm including Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and many other minor prophets who were at the same time. They had a particular style of their message. And this chapter 2 perfectly catches the characteristics of Hebrew prophets in that day. Now, there's been some doubt about whether this is one unified sermon. The reason there's been the doubt is it switches from the masculine to the feminine gender about 3 times. It goes back and forth and back and forth. And some of us said it's different sermons put together. But if you read this chapter, it has a logical flow to it. And so either Jeremiah stuck his sermons together so well that you can't tell it, or maybe Baruch did, or it's simply he just keeps flipping the metaphors back and forth between individuals and the nation. And which it is, I'm really not sure. Now notice where it says, "Now the word of the Lord came to me saying." I think it's important that we realize that the word of the Lord in Hebrew is much, much more than when I say, I'm going to speak to you. Or even when I say that I have a word from the Lord, speaking as a 20th century American, I don't have the meaning in that phrase that this 8th century prophet did. You see, the Word of God was a powerful, acting, alive kind of thing. The Word of God is what created the world. God spoke and the world popped into existence. It's the idea of the patriarchal blessing that once it goes out, it cannot be revoked or altered. And so the Word had a power. And so here we have the power and influence of God coming upon Jeremiah. This whole chapter, many see it as a reflection of, remember those Hittite Suzerain treaties we talked about in Deuteronomy? This has some same characteristics of that. Especially the word that means a legal lawsuit. And it's translated in your Bible, contend, in verse 9 twice and in verse 29. And so maybe we have a court case here. And God has brought Israel before the court of the heavens. And you'll see that a little bit later when it says, "Oh heavens," then in verse 12. It's like there's a court scene and God has brought a suit. And Israel and Judah must answer. Now we need to think about these terms through here. When Jeremiah says the word Israel, who is he referring to? Israel. Well, if he says the sons of Israel, he could be referring to the Jewish nation, the Jewish people. But remember, we're in a time of Jewish history when the whole northern 10 tribes have been taken captive. They were taken into captivity by Assyria in 722 BC. And it's much later than that now. A matter of fact, Israel, the southern 2 tribes known as Judah, will go into captivity in 586, and we're not a whole long way from that, 40 years or so. So when he says Israel, he's either speaking of the northern 10 tribes known as Ephraim, Israel, oftentimes called Samaria, or he's going to speak of Judah, which is the southern 2 tribes. Now, our problem in interpreting Jeremiah is these things seem awful fluid. Sometimes they can refer to both. It's very hard to put a particular and specific label on every time. Well, here's what God said to Jeremiah. "Go and proclaim in the ears of Jerusalem, saying, thus saith the Lord. Jeremiah spoke with some prophecy. Jeremiah didn't say, now I've thought about this and I'm going to tell you what I think. Or he didn't say, I had my degree in political science of the 8th century and I'm going to tell you what it looks like. He says, thus saith the Lord. Okay? I remember concerning your devotion of your youth, the love of your betrothals, your following after me in the wilderness through a land not sown. Now the prophet's going to go back to, I'm sure, to what was an idealistic time in the life of Israel. When Israel was first brought out of Egypt, it's almost like he's calling that the honeymoon period. And Israel was so in love with God, and God was certainly in love with Israel. This whole picture here through chapter 2 is God as a husband, Israel as his wife. That's the same thing the prophet Hosea picked up on, that God was the husband and his people were the wife. That is a shockingly intimate metaphor to talk about God. But I think that is the kind of relationship between God and his people. It's almost as intimate and personal as the marriage relationship. It has no sexual connotations. It's that intimate knowledge of one another. Okay? Now the word devotion here, I remember you concerning your devotion, that's that beautiful covenant word used only between God and his people. It's the Hebrew word hesed. I like to translate it, and I think you ought to write it in your Bible unless you know this. Faithful covenant love. Faithful covenant love. Because Jeremiah's charge through all of this is going to be, you've broken the covenant. Okay? You've broken the covenant. Now the word betrothals there implies a married state, the honeymoon kind of thing. And when it says, when you followed me in the wilderness through a land not sown, it's just talking about the desert of Sinai. Now Ezekiel, he would say, you turkeys, you've been idolatrous from the first. And he had mentioned the golden calf and all the Baal worship during the wilderness. But Jeremiah sees it a little more idealistically, a little more, you know, those wedding pictures you used to see that had the kind of a fuzz around the girl's face. Well, that's the way Jeremiah looked back at the wilderness experience. A little, maybe not in reality so much in the way he viewed it. Now, notice where it says in verse 3, Israel was holy to the Lord. Now, what does that mean? We've talked about the word holy over and over. What does the word holy mean? What is the etymology? Set apart, okay? Israel was set apart in a special way as belonging to God. She was his unique treasure. Exodus 19. She was his wife. She was special. She was his choice among all the nations to reveal himself. Okay? That's what it's talking about. Notice where it says, the first fruits of his harvest. Now that goes back to Leviticus 23, 11 and 12, 10 and 11, where we talked about it Sunday. A little bit of a normal field of barley was reaped. And it was willowed by hand. What's not willowed, what's it called? Winnowed. What is it? Yeah, that's it. And then it was ground up and offered to the Lord. Well, it showed two things. It showed that the Lord owned all the harvest and He was providing man's needs. And second, it showed that as the first ripened parts of barley, the first crop that ripened, as it came was the promise of all the rest of the harvest to come. And so that's what Israel was. She was both of those things. Now, this very word, the first fruits, is used for Israel here. But in James chapter 1, verse 18, it's used to describe the church. It's very common for phrases that describe the church, phrases that describe Israel in the Old Testament, the people of God, describe the church in the New Testament. And in 1 Corinthians 15:20, that's what I preached on last Sunday, it describes Jesus Christ as the first fruit from the dead. Okay. Now look at the last part of verse 3 where it says, and all who ate of it became guilty. Evil came upon them, declares the Lord. Now the word all who ate of it, from the Akkadian language, we have found that this word ate of it can refer to an invasion. Invasion of one nation into another nation. And maybe that's the idea here is, those who pick on Israel, God will pick on them. And that was part of the covenant promise to Abraham. Remember that? back in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, and then repeated again in Genesis 27:29. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, is the idea there. Okay? And so these nations are in the hand of God, but God will judge them for bringing judgment on His people. And so it's a symbol of God's protection and care. Then in verse 4, hear the word of the Lord, O house of Jacob, and all the families of the house of Israel. Now there it's obviously using these two phrases in that sense of the northern 10 tribes and the southern 2. Now the northern 10 tribes are gone into captivity. But there was a few people left. You couldn't take everybody. That some would hide in caves. There was a few people left. And we know from Josiah's reform, which is occurring sometimes simultaneous with the book of Jeremiah, that they tried to get those northern Jews back into coming to the temple. And so here he's referring to both the northern 10 tribes, house of Jacob refer to all of them, the families of Israel, those northern 10 tribes. Now in verse 5. For thus saith the Lord, what injustice did your fathers find in me, that they went far from me and walked after emptiness and became empty? I think he's saying, what did I do? How did I break the covenant? What did I do that you broke our marriage relationship? What guilt do I have? What problem did I cause that you would do this to me? Now when it says went far from me, that implies in the service of another. And that's exactly what Israel did. She had idolatry come into the very core of her worship of Yahweh. And he continues in verse 6. And they did not say, where is the Lord who brought us out of the land of Egypt, who led us through the wilderness, through a land of deserts and pits, through a land of drought and deep darkness? Now that word deep darkness is the very word used in Psalms 23:4, through the valley of the shadow of death. That's that same word. It means severe danger, severe problems, severe tension. God's saying, I led you through the wilderness. All the problems out there. No food, no water, protection from the elements, protection from marauding bands. I protected you. You can't say where was God, because I did miracle after miracle after miracle providing for your needs. You know, what's happened here? And then verse 7. And I brought you into a fruitful land. Now the word, does any of you have the land of Carmel? What translation is that, Terry? Spanish translation. The word Carmel in Hebrew means garden, park, orchard. And so I think it should be translated, I brought you into a prosperous, fruitful land. Okay? To eat its fruit and its good things, but you came and defiled my land, and my inheritance you made an abomination. How? Idolatry. Now I want you to know the fairness of God. God is no respecter of persons. He told the Amorites, which is a collective term for all the nations of Canaan before the Jews came in there, in Genesis 15:6, He told them that He was going to give them time to repent, and they would not. And He took them out of the land in judgment on their lifestyle. When Israel went a-whoring after other gods, He did the very same thing to Israel that He did to the other nations. And I think that shows the fairness of God, the even-handedness of God. In verse 8, there are 4 groups that are mentioned, the leaders of the nation of Israel, who are responsible for the abomination and spiritual adultery that was occurring. First of all was the priest. The priest did not say, where is the Lord? And those who handle the law did not know me. Now that includes the priests, but it also includes the Levites. The Levites were the teachers of the law in the outlying places from Jerusalem. Now you had to be a Levite to be a priest, but you didn't have to be a priest to be a Levite. So there are many Levites who weren't priests, and they were teachers. We would call them, in Jesus' day, scribes. Okay? Now the word there, you did not know me, does anybody have any other translation? Anything else? Now, to read that in English, that doesn't mean doodly nothing. But that Hebrew word means an intimate, personal relationship with. He's not saying you didn't know about me. He's not saying you didn't know the ritual. He's not saying you didn't know the Bible. He's saying you didn't have a relationship with me. Even Old Testament faith is not a mental belief in something, nor emotional reaction to something. It is a volitional commitment to trust, love, and obey God. And what he's saying is, these folks were leaders, but all they knew is mechanical. They did not have a relationship with me. The third group is the rulers, also transgressed against me. Does yours have a little footnote or something in the bottom that tells you the word rulers is the word shepherd? I think King James put pastors. It's an unfortunate translation. It's talking about the civil leaders, not the spiritual leaders. This is the king and the other official civil leaders. And you see that from many, many places in the Old Testament. I'll just give you one example, 2 Samuel 5:2. And the fourth group, of course, was the prophets who prophesied by Baal and walked after the things that did not profit. Now up here when he mentioned that they have gone to nothingness, where is that word? Emptiness, last part of verse 5. That's the word that the author of Ecclesiastes uses a whole lot. Vanity of vanity, nothingness. It's sometimes a word that's used for idolatry, that idols are non-existent. They're just worshiping their own hands, what they've made. There's no reality there. Now in verse 9 is a brand new paragraph, and we're getting into a more specific idea of this legal case against the nation of Israel by God. It's like God has taken Israel to court to answer for her unfaithfulness. It's almost like a divorce suit, if you please. Now, therefore I will yet contend, bring a legal suit against you, declares the Lord. And with your sons' sons I will bring a legal suit. Woo! Well, I remember Deuteronomy 5:9 says that he will visit the iniquity of the fathers on the third generation. Is that what I forgot what number the generations are there. You say, that is unfair. You mean the sons pay for the sins of the father? Yeah. How? Communicated lifestyle priorities. We transmit to our kids what's most important to us. If we're most important to us, the kids get it. If God's most important to us, the kids get it. So we communicate our lifestyle to our children, our priority structure, our values. Now, they may rebel for a while. There's a good biblical promise that says if you raise up a child in the way he should go, it doesn't say he won't leave. Most children do. It says when he's old, he'll not depart from it. Okay? Now, notice verse 10. For cross to the coastlands of Kittim and send to Kedar and observe closely. Now, Kittim and Kedar are not twins. Kittim is a reference to the Phoenician settlements on the island of Cyprus. That's what it originally meant. But then it widened out to mean all the islands in the Mediterranean. And then it widened out to mean the west. Everything to the west was known as Kittim. And this little thing, Kedar, or Cedar, is the name of an Arab tribe directly east of Palestine. It's mentioned several times in the Bible. So what we have here is a literary metaphor for what? Search the east, search the west, and you won't find what I'm talking about. Okay, that's what it's talking about, east and west. And see if there has been such a thing as this. And here's the charge. Has a nation changed gods when they were no gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which does not profit. Even the heathens didn't run around changing gods. They may add one. They may change their place in the pantheon. But friends, no heathen nation ever just discarded its gods and got a new one. That's exactly what Israel did. Just changed gods in middle stream. God delivered her from Egypt, brought her through the wilderness, gave her the promised land, fought for her, did the miraculous, and she said, thanks a lot, see you later. This over here is more appealing to me. Now, the very fact when it says that changed gods when they were no gods tells me that even by the 8th century, a more fully developed monotheism was already in place theologically. The 8th century prophets witnessed pretty exclusively that there is one God and there is no other God. There may be angelic powers, but there's no other gods but one. Now, about the way the word says that profits nothing is that word vanity again, vainness, emptiness. Now, here in verse 12, be appalled, O heavens, at this. Many times in the Bible, the heavens are asked to be witnesses of what God is doing, to be witnesses to the court case. I'll give you a couple of examples that you probably remember from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 4:26 and Deuteronomy 32:1. Okay? The heavens are asked to be witnesses. Notice in verse 13, for it says, for my people have committed two evils. Here's the charges against Israel. Okay? Number one, they have forsaken me. And then down in verse 14, they've become a slave to other nations and other gods. They left God and they went to other gods. There they are. Two sides of one coin, maybe. Notice where it mentions here, they have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters. Now, immediately, New Testament, what comes to your mind? Fountain of living waters. What biblical story? Yeah, the woman of Sychar. Jesus offered her living water. And then a little later on in John, Jesus says, I am the living water. Now what we have here is a name for God. In Psalms 36:9, the covenant God of Israel is called by this name. This is a title for God. Now to a people in a desert, that's a special title. Have you ever watched one of those old movies late at night about the French Foreign Legion? And every time the commercial comes, you go get another drink of water? You watch the sand and the camels, you just get thirstier and thirstier? Well, for arid people, this was a precious name. It's transferred to Jesus in the New Testament. That's a very common. John 4:10 through 14, John 7:38, 39, Revelation 21:6. These names are applied to Christ. They have hewn for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns. Now, on one side is God's provision, okay? He is the God of the living waters. He gives it freely. On the other side is man's effort. He's going to say, I don't need you, I'll dig cisterns, thank you. I'll just collect the water nature gives. And there's a paradox there. Now, cistern, if you've been to Israel or seen any books, you'll know that everybody had cisterns. They were like Coca-Cola bottles dug into the ground. We went to one of them in Megiddo that I guess, Phil, big as this room, large as this auditorium, you had stairs going down to it, and little channels dug. Their cities were built on a hill, and little channels all around that hill were channeled into that cistern. So every drop of water that fell on that acre or 10 acres went right into that cistern. Well, you can imagine in a dry country it only rains once a year, and that's in the spring. If it doesn't rain any other time, if you don't collect that water when it comes, you're going to die. It's a matter of life or death in the desert. How would you like it if you found your cistern had a crack in the bottom after the rains came and the water was leaking out through the formation? So that's what Israel had done. She had trusted in herself and in foreign gods. What an irony. Verse 14. Now here's the next little metaphor. It's talking about Israel's a slave. God says, I made you free, and you put the yoke back on yourself again. Is Israel a slave? Or is he a homeborn servant? Now this is referring to Israel, the northern 10 tribes. It's referring to the Assyrian captivity of Israel, where they made them a slave. Look at verse 15. The young lions have roared at him. They have roared loudly. Well, in the Bible, young lions are a symbol many times of nations. And the metaphor there is strong, powerful. That's the idea of a lion, especially a young lion. Now, look at verse 16. Also the men of Memphis and Freeport. Well, maybe it's not Freeport, but whatever that Egyptian name is, I don't know how to pronounce it. Taphanes? That's closer. That's more biblical. Yes, this Tallahassee. These are two cities. If you have a map in the back of your Bible, you have these two cities located. One of them is about 25 miles from Cairo, and one of them is on the lake. I knew I was going to forget how to pronounce that dumb thing. It's the lake up north. It's salty water. Menzipah, something like that. Well, heck, if we can call it Tallahassee, we can make it Lake Livingston, can't we? That northern lake. These are the northern cities in the north of Egypt, okay? They were both ancient capitals, which the power here. The men of these two ancient capitals have shaved the crown of your head. Now, I'm sure that some of you have different translation than that. What does King James have, Phil? Grazed? Broken. Anybody have the word grazed? Vernon, do you want to give a personal testimony of what having your head grazed means? Go comment. This is a very ambivalent Hebrew word. It can mean graze, like cattle grazing something too short. It can mean shaved, like shaved head. It can mean broken head. We're not sure what it means. It either means death blow to the head or great shame from being overpowered. And that's the idea here, whatever it means specifically. So Egypt had come in and taken control. If you remember the history when I took the introduction, the nation of Judah was a vassal of some world power. It may have been Egypt for a period. It may have been Assyria for a period. It may have been Babylon for a period. She always was under somebody's thumb. And here the reference in verse 14 is to Assyria, and the reference to verse 16 is to Egypt. Okay? Now it says, look at verse 17. Have you not done this to yourself? And look at verse 19 real quick. Your own wickedness will correct you. I like to say something that's kind of biblical, I think, there when it says, be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, nation soweth. That shall that man, nation reap. Israel did this to herself. Israel is responsible for what's happening to her. The guilt is not on the doorstep of God. It's on the doorstep of Israel and his rebellious children. By forsaking the Lord your God when He led you in the way. And now, what are you doing on the road to Egypt? Well, the prophets just lambasted political alliances. Drink the waters of the Nile. Or what are you doing on the road to Assyria to drink the waters of the Euphrates? Now, to drink the waters of is a biblical metaphor for doing voluntary service to someone. So it's not like these countries are coming and taking Israel over or Judah over. They're going to these countries for help and saying, now, Egypt, would you help us? And Syria, would you help us? Israel and Judah are the ones that are playing the fool in this. Now, you see it says the Nile River in your translation, verse 18 probably. If you have a little note, the Hebrew there is Shihor. It means blackness. Now, some have thought that that's a derogatory kind of way of talking about the Nile River, who was one of the chief gods of the Egyptians. But I think a little bit better, archaeologically, is this was the name for some of the tributaries of the Nile River. And so that seems much better. And when it talks about Euphrates, wherever in the Bible it says the river, the river, it's always the Euphrates, always. And that's what it has here, the river. And it's obvious the Euphrates because of the mention of Assyria. Now, notice in verse 19 the word apostasies, and your apostasies will reprove you. Now that comes from the same root. It comes from the word to turn. That's the same root for the word repentance. Man can turn to God in faith, or man can turn away from God in apostasy, and man is the one who decides which way he's going to go in life. God can lead and woo, but man picks the path. Now in verse 20 and following, down through 25, is one of the most startling, and the prophets are just quite frank in what they say, and their metaphors might shock you, but I didn't write this. Jeremiah did. He's going to liken the nation of Israel and tie them in with the fertility worship that they're caught up in these fertility gods and goddesses. So he's going to liken Israel to sexual looseness. This is what he does. For long ago I broke your yoke and tore off your bonds, but you said, I will not serve. Now, does yours have I broke your yoke, or does it have you broke your yoke? I? Who has you? What translation, Phyllis? Revised Standard. You is the Hebrew. And the question is, did God break their yoke and set them free? Or did they break God's yoke, the covenant, and set themselves free and go after? Anyway, we have a loose animal. A domestic animal that's gotten loose and just running around. And here's what the animal does. For on every high hill and under every green tree you have laid down as the harlot. Now, I want to turn over to Hosea chapter 4, because that doesn't say much to me. But Hosea 4, 11 through 14 describes exactly what he's talking about. Harlotry, wine, and new wine take away the understanding. My people consult their wooden idol, and their diviner's wand informs them. For a spirit of harlotry has led them astray, and they have played the harlot, departing from their God. And they offer sacrifices on the tops of mountains, and they burn incense on the hills under oak, poplar, and terebinth. Because their shade is pleasant. Therefore, your daughters play the harlot, your brides commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they play the harlot, or your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go apart with harlots and offer sacrifices with temple prostitutes. And so the people are without understanding and ruined. The mothers would teach the daughters the sexual worship of the fertility gods. The new bride would go to the mountaintops first. Now I want to tell you, how does that fit into the theology of Israel? Why, it is the pits, the pure pits. This is the worship of the fertility gods that Israel had become entangled with every time she came in contact with them. And so here she is worshiping on the top of the hills and under the green trees. Implication there is the temple prostitutes would go to the trees. Why? Because it's shade. Pretty common, I guess. Look at verse 21. Yet I planted you a choice vine. That word means, it's the word S-O-R-E-F. I don't know how you pronounce that in Hebrew. It means the red grape. It's the choicest grape there is. Now, I'm not sure of this, but I read this in a commentary today, and maybe some of y'all know. Most grape vines come from cuttings, not from seeds. If you plant a seed of a grape, there's no telling what kind of plant will come out of it. It may be a real stinking grape from the seed. But if you take a cut off the plant and plant the cut, the same kind of grape will come from the cut that comes from the mother plant. But you can't trust the seed. There's too much built-in inferior genes in those grape seeds. So what's happened here is that Israel is compared to that. They bought the best vines that God could find. That reminds me of Isaiah chapter 5, 1 through 7. God did everything He could for Israel. Instead of good grapes, the stinking wild grapes came. Now, notice where it says, how have you turned yourself before me into the degenerate shoots of a foreign vine? Okay? Look at verse 22. Although you wash yourself with lye, that's mineral alkali, or use soap, vegetable alkali, the stain of your iniquity is before me, declares the Lord. Friends, you can wash your hands all you want to. God told Israel the stain won't come off. How can you say, I am not defiled? I have not gone after the Baals. Look at your way in the valley. Now, there's a good example. If you don't know something about biblical words and biblical backgrounds and have some kind of book to help you ferret out all this, that's not going to mean nothing to you. Baal, of course, is the word for husband or master. It's the name for the male fertility god of the Canaanite religion. Ashtoreth is the name of the female consort. Now, when it says in the valley, one translation I read, I think it was the Peshitta, maybe it was the New Jerusalem, I forgot, had, look at your footprints in the valley. The valley here is the reference to the valley of the sons of Hinnom, which in Jesus' day He called Gehenna, the name for hell. It is the place where the god Molech was worshipped. You can see that from Jeremiah 7:32 and from Psalms 106:37, where these Hebrews, covenant people, would sacrifice their first child on the arms of this fire god to ensure the fertility of the wife and of the field. The Jews spit every time they thought of this later. And here we go into another metaphor. He says, you think you haven't done anything? Here's Jeremiah says, you're like the swift young camel entangling her ways. There's a kind of camel that runs about 3 miles an hour. There's another kind of camel runs about 9 miles an hour. And the Arabs like the fast one. It's kind of like a sports car camel, I guess. But when they're young, they really just crisscross and go in and out. They don't go a straight line. They're kind of aimless. Well, that's the metaphor here. God's people were like that, just going everywhere. Look at the next thing Isaiah says. You're like a wild donkey accustomed to the wilderness that sniffs the wind in her passion. In the time of her heat, who can turn her away? And all who seek her will not become weary. Wild donkeys, when they come in season, the girls chase the boys. And the way to capture donkeys is tie up one male, and every girl in smelling distance will come, and you just put them in the pen. Dumb donkeys. Dumb people. They were acting this way. This is the way God's people were going after these fertility gods. Okay? Notice here where it mentions, verse 25, keep your feet from being unshod and your throat from thirst. There's two possibilities here. The Jewish commentator Rashi said that what we have here is a literal fulfillment of the nation of Judah going into captivity barefooted and, crying. Maybe. Context seems to be it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor that here is Israel running after these sexual gods, these fertility gods, and she's followed them so long and so hard that her shoes have worn out and her throat is hoarse from calling out to them. What a picture of God's people. And notice what Israel says for herself. But you said it is hopeless. No, for I have loved strangers, and after them I will walk. Israel and Judah had become trapped by their own sensual desires. And they said, we know it's wrong, but we will not turn back. In verse 26, another paragraph is started. And the metaphor here is the metaphor of a thief breaking into a house. And when he's caught, how ashamed he is. That's the way Israel is. She's breaking into another God's house and been caught by God. Notice here where it says, the thief is shamed when he is discovered, and so the house of Israel is shamed. They, their kings, their princesses, their priests, their prophets, who say to it, now look at this real careful, verse 27, who say to a tree, you are my father, and to a stone, you are my mother. Now, again, you've got to have something to help you see what's happening. The stone was a symbol of the male fertility god. The tree was a symbol of the female fertility god. But look at your text. Jeremiah has switched the gender. And it's like the confused Israel is calling the rock its mother and the tree its daddy. They're so confused, they don't even know what sex the god is they're worshiping. So it's real irony and paradox here, that they could even do that. But I think that's what it's saying. It's unusual that they would say, you are my father, and speak of the fertility cult. Now, of course, here the word father doesn't mean what the Christian term means. Here it has the sexual implication. And of course, that has nothing to do with Jesus calling God Father. Nothing at all. Notice the last part of verse 7 where it says, but in time of trouble they will say, arise and save us. Now the word save us here is, of course, the Hebrew use of the term save. Has nothing to do with spiritual salvation. Has to do with physical deliverance. What God's saying is, well, yeah, but when you get between a rock and a hard place, when you get in trouble, you're going to cry out to me to save you. And it's the way God answers. When you cry out to me to save you, when you get in a hard time, here's what you do, my people. But where are your gods, which you made for yourselves? Let them arise, if they can save you in the time of trouble. For according to the number of your cities are your gods, O Judah. There was a Baal for every town. There's even a rabbi that said, there is a Baal for every street in Jerusalem. You know them all through the Old Testament. The Baal of Peor, the Baal of Gad. There was a Baal for every city, a different fertility god for every city. That's how bad it had become in Israel. Verse 29 is the last paragraph. It goes back to the legal thing again. Why do you contend with me? You have all transgressed against me, declares the Lord. In vain I have struck your sons, and they accept no chastening. This is I think, probably where the author of Hebrews, chapter 5, verse 12 and following, got the idea that God chastens and instructs His children. And if God hadn't chastened and instructed you, you're not a child. Israel would not take God's training and discipline. Notice where it says in verse 30, your sword has devoured your prophets. Now, archaeologically, we have found many swords from this area, or arena, or time. And many of them are shaped like an animal's head, a lion or a tiger or something. And the blade of the sword is the tongue of the animal. So maybe it's quite literal when it says the sword has devoured. That's a picture of a carnivorous animal eating prey. It may be more literal than we think here. Notice the last part of verse 31. Why do my people say, we are free to roam, we will come to thee no more? Here's the metaphor again of an animal that's broken out of its pen or harness or yoke, and it's just running around. It doesn't know where it belongs, doesn't know where it goes, doesn't know who owns it. It's just a loose animal. That's the way Israel is. God's people are like that. Look at verse 32. Can a virgin forget her ornaments, or a bride her attire? Now, there's a lot of ambiguity in these Hebrew words. But this word attire seems to be, now, in our day and time, a wedding ring would be, that tells people that the person who wears that is married. Okay? If it's on the left hand, and that finger, it says, I'm taken, thank you. Now, in Israel, women wore a sash, a certain kind of sash, when they got married. It was part of her bridal attire that told everybody this woman is married. Israel had taken her sash off so that nobody would know she's married. See the picture of breaking the fidelity of the covenant? The ornaments would be, forgotten that word. What's the name of that stuff you buy, Peggy, when you go on a honeymoon? Peignoir set? What is it? No, it's something else. What is it? Peignoir. Huh? I never claimed to have knowledge in all areas. That's what I think it's talking about. A particular outfit a bride would have on her honeymoon that, of course, would mean a lot to her. Now, yet my people have forgotten me, days without number. It hadn't just been a little while. God says, generation after generation you've been playing the harlot. Now, I think literally after fertility gods and spiritually after other gods. It uses the word two different ways. How will you prepare your way to seek love? Therefore, even the wicked women you have taught your ways. Now look at verse 33. I want somebody read me King James real loud, verse 33. Okay. Phyllis, read Revised Standard for me real loud, would you, on verse 33? Here's the picture. Now here's Jeremiah preaching in Jerusalem, and he says, people of God, you've become so adept in making love with fertility gods that you can teach professional prostitutes how to make love. Golly. What a castigation. Verse 34. Also your skirts, on your skirts is found the lifeblood of innocent poor. Now the word skirts here, the Septuagint has the word hands. On your hands is innocent blood, but I think skirts is probably a better Hebrew thing. This idea about lifeblood of innocent poor, if you look at 2 Kings 21:16, Manasseh killed a lot of innocent people. It may refer to this. When it says you did not find them breaking in Exodus 22:1 and 2, there's an ancient law that says if you catch a thief breaking in your house, anybody can kill him and they're not guilty. But what the prophet is saying, he wasn't breaking in your house, and you killed him anyway. Now, look at Israel says, "Yet you have said, I am innocent. Surely his anger is turned away from me. Behold, I will enter into judgment with you because you have said, I have not sinned." Now, isn't that an unbelievable picture? The temple was full. Sacrifices were being made. The preachers were preaching. The lights of the temple were lit. Prosperity was in the land. And God says, "You fools, you think you know me, and you don't know me at all. You say we have not sinned, and you are a great sinner." Man trying to rationalize away his actions. And God saying, "You will pay for your actions." The last part. Why do you go around so much changing your ways? I think one translation I read said, "Why do you change your ways so slightly?" I think it's New English Bible. It's the idea that Israel is wandering this direction, that direction. They're not going back to God. They're just wandering around aimlessly, okay, like in the wilderness again. Also, you shall be put to shame by Egypt, as you were put to shame by Assyria. And from this place you shall go out with your hands on your head, for the Lord has rejected those in whom you trust, and you shall not prosper with them. Now, when I think of putting hands on your head, what do y'all think to see this kind of thing? A 7-Eleven robbery, right? That's what when I picture that, I picture the U-Totem getting robbed or something. Yeah, jumping jacks. Well, I thought this must mean captivity. But that's a good example of me doing what I've told you not to 100 times. I was letting my culture define this symbol. This doesn't mean captivity or surrender to an ancient people. This meant mourning. And some see it as a symbol of God's hand on them. So to have their hands on their head would be a symbol of mourning. Mourning what? Because of captivity that had come for Israel and that was coming for Judah.